Here. Father in heaven, we thank you for your kindness to us, that we get to come and to enjoy getting your word open and to see some of this stuff that it's fun. I mean, it's interesting for sure. This isn't the gospel 101 in that sense, but it does certainly connect to the good news of what the Lord Jesus has accomplished on the cross for us and against your enemies. And so we ask you for your continued wisdom and guidance as we study this out. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so last week we began to, the last couple weeks, we've been talking about these rebellions. We saw the rebellion of Genesis 3, Satan's rebellion prior to that, whatever it was. He comes and tempts Adam and Eve. They mess up. They rebelled against God's command. And then we saw last time some of the curses that came from that. And remember that what we're doing here is we're answering the question, why is the world messed up? And we know that, certainly with Satan, but then he wanted to corrupt humanity. And so when Adam and Eve sinned, it caused all of their descendants to be born with this sinful nature, And so that has caused a lot of trouble. And then what we've seen in the book of Genesis is this progression of understanding where Moses is writing very, very succinctly, hey guys, I can't give you a thorough history of the primeval world, but I'm going to give you the big tidbits. And remember what we said. I always like this little chart here. And if this is Genesis 1 and 2, the creation, we'll just put God here. We'll put the flood here. We'll put Babel, which we're going to talk about next time. And then we'll go over here to the Exodus. And let's just say 1450 BC. The flood we'll put at 3200 BC. This is important. So that after the Exodus, Moses is writing Genesis. Okay? And so that's important because one of the things we've been discussing is which comes first, the history of Genesis or the writing? History. And the history. So what we've been seeing is that after the flood, you have 1,500 years or more, about 1,700 years of human history that has taken place after the flood. Cultures have spread out and expanded, people have expanded. And so as Moses is writing, he's describing the original rebellion in Genesis 3. Well, that got taken care of at the flood after all the sin happened. And then through the 8 people, sin has reoccurred, and here we are. That's another judgment. Okay, but prior to the flood, he's describing, Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Then he gives a little bit of their genealogy. Then he describes in chapter 5 another genealogy of Adam all the way down to Noah. And then in chapter 6, he starts talking about, hey, when there was a lot of multiplication going on, there was a lot of children being born. Let's look at that page 2. Genesis 6, because the secondly heavenly rebellion. We talked a little bit last time, and we gave the parameters that the sons of God were fallen angels that came down and chose women and impregnated them, and then they produced these hybrids. It's really, really odd. But what I want us to see as we read this really quick is how short it is. And so, just right there, when humankind began to multiply in the face of the earth, daughters were born to them. Okay, so now we have families. We have daughters. Then the sons of God, we already described, you can see below that they're angels, saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful. Thus they took wives, or really it literally says women, for themselves from any that they chose. So the Lord said, my spirit will not remain in humankind indefinitely, since they are mortal. They will remain for 120 more years. And so we know at that point it was 120 years until the flood. So basically Noah had 120 years to work on building the ark. We know that this isn't mankind's lifespan is going to be 120 years because these guys still lived for a long time. Abraham, after this, several, 1,000 years later, it's lived to be 175. So clearly this is not a reference to God limiting mankind to 120 years. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The Nephilim are the offspring, okay? giants. Some versions will say giants, but the literal Hebrew is the Nephilim, were on the earth in those days. In those days, he's writing it here, and also after. So he's saying, hey, everybody, you just spied out the lands, and you saw these big giants there. Well, just so you know, they were in the earth in those days and also afterward, which you obviously seen them because the 10 spies went, and they said, oh, no, we saw the Nephilim there. We can't do it. So Moses is writing, explaining to them that they were before and after the flood. That's what he's saying here. The Nephilim were in the earth in those days and also after this, when the angels came down, were having sexual relations with daughters of humankind who gave birth to their children. These Nephilim, the children, these hybrids, were the mighty heroes of old, the famous men. Okay, now, and then in Genesis 6:5, it says, and the wicked and intent of the hearts of humanity is evil from their youth. And then he goes in and he starts talking about how he's going to flood the earth. And then he picks Noah in Genesis 6:9. But in this section, what's missing here? There could be a lot. That's a very open-ended question.
Like, where do we start?
So yeah, where do we start? What's missing here? Just
How did we get Nephilim after the flood?
okay. I think it answers it, but I'll answer that in a second. One thing that we're missing is any sort of what God thought about it, what God did about it, what if God judged anything, what was the ramifications. So we don't see any of that here. Nothing, zero, right? There's no mention of judgment. What happened to the angels? Was God okay with it? We just know he was out of the flood. That's really important because when we're going to study the New Testament perspective today. Now, in Genesis 6:4 there, if you want to, circle the word when in 6:4, because I sent an article out to you guys a couple weeks ago. It was an article I had written for a book that's coming out on this specific topic. And what I did in that article was trying to address very specifically and clearly how these Nephilim appeared in the time of Moses. Because I thought they were all drowned. How did they get here? And so there's several theories about how they reappear. One is, well, they were good swimmers. Okay? They swam for a year. The flood was on the earth for a year. They were good swimmers. Check that off, okay, as being not on the list. Another one is that there was only a local flood. That the flood was local and therefore they just went to higher ground. Well, all you gotta do is read. Yeah, everything. You know, and when it's interesting, even scholars that reject the literal nature of a worldwide flood, they still say, hey, the Hebrew's clear. It was a worldwide flood. We don't believe it, but it's a worldwide flood, because that's the language, okay? And there's a whole bunch of other reasons, okay, scientifically and other things. So check that off the list, that they went to higher ground. The other one is that they went underground. Well, that's speculation. We have no idea. It could be true, could be not be true, but that's not the sense that you get. God says in Genesis at the end, everything that had breath, not fish,
This the one.
dead, okay? And then we know that they were breathing, okay? The fourth one is that at the time of the flood, you had Noah and his wife, and then you have the 3 boys and their wives. So maybe one of them had the Nephilim gene, and it came through, and therefore afterwards, a new baby pops out, and she carried the gene, and it became activated, and therefore there you had the Nephilim. I don't think that's the case either. That's nice speculation. But in Hebrew, what it says here, and what I did in that article is laid it out in a block diagram. You learn this when you're taking, Hebrew classes or Greek classes, language classes, in clauses and relative particles and coordinating and conjunctions, all this grammar. Well, it says here, so Mike, to answer your question, Moses tells us right here, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterwards when? When what? What he's telling us with the word when is the how. So if you want to know the how of both before and after, he says it right here. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and after, in the manner of, you want to know how it happened when the sons of God were having relations with women. What that proves conclusively, again, if you block it out, which is what I did, is that some fallen angels came down afterwards again. Just like it, what it's showing you is how it happened before was exactly how it happened afterwards. And most of that argumentation is in the article that I emailed you. Okay, I didn't put it here because I emailed it. All right, but that's the answer. Is very, very clear. And okay, so
the end of the verse says, "Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown."
Mm-hmm. So what you have here, that's important too, because the Nephil, the those, that's, demonstratives, right? Those or they, this is they, but really it's those, or it could be they. But those are, what's it referencing? Who is the those? Well, it's a reference to the Nephilim, the fallen hybrid children. Oftentimes we say, oh, the mighty heroes, those are the angels. The angels were in the way, again, if you looked at the article, you have a main clause here with the Nephilim, then you have these subordinate clauses with the sons of God over here, and then it starts another main clause, the they, or the those. Those are the Nephilim. That's who he's talking about. So he goes back to talking about the Nephilim because he just explained the sons of God. The main topic of verse 4 is the Nephilim. It's not the sons of God. That's just, hey, by the way, we're talking about how they got here. These guys over here, the Nephilim, were these heroes, these demigods, okay, if you want to look at it that way. And as we talked about, in the history from the flood on, Mesopotamian history, Egyptian history, Greek history, they all have these stories of these demigods, of these divinities coming down, making human women, producing these heroes of old. That's why Moses would say, hey, these were the mighty ones, heroes of old. You guys know about these. Now I'm telling you who they are. I'm giving you the true version. They were the heroes of old that you've been hearing about. And really what is it, the word here, famous men, or what I've read in parentheses is ones of reputation. Because a lot of people say, oh, it says men. These were mankind. The word ish in Hebrew has a variety of different nuances. It could mean like a literal male, a human male, or it could mean somebody or a person. And that's really, I think these were people or persons or ones of reputation. And you see it being translated as ones in other places. So it's not making an argument that it's a human male. It's just saying, hey, these are the guys of reputation, of name. It literally says men of name.
Did they only have male offspring?
As far as we know, yes. How that worked, I don't know. What you don't see is female Nephilim getting together with male Nephilim and producing other Nephilim. You don't see that.
These other like
Like a donkey. Yep. So could it be true? We just don't know. But the sons of God, angels were coming down, and it was happening according to the grammar here repeatedly, habitually, over and over and over. From when? We know the flood wiped them out, but as we said before, and we'll see it again, that if you look at the genealogy of in Genesis 5, there's one guy, one of the kids, his name is Jared. And Jared, it's just a form of a Hebrew word, Yaran, meaning come down. So did they name him Jared because this is when the angels were coming down? Some scholars will say, yeah, that's why he got the name. There's some papers there, guys. Grab some papers there for the notes. So we don't know, but it could have been centuries that this was happening. And most likely, if you took a look at the genealogy, it was. Okay. These are Christopher's college buddies. Yeah.
Hi.
So welcome, gentlemen. All right. So let's go to page 3. If you notice in the book of Jubilees, right there at the top, what we're looking at is these writings during the Second Temple period, or intertestamental, right around before Jesus and before. You have a lot of writings that were taking place, all kinds of writings, the Apocrypha, etc. But if you notice in Jubilees, on the right there, it says he called his name Jared, for in his days the angels of the Lord descended on earth, those who are named watchers. So that's crystal clear. They believe that it was the days of Jared, which create, if that's true, which this isn't scripture, but it is interesting what they believed during the time of Jesus. they, probably for the same reason, they knew the verb means to come down. Okay, so the rest of those, we looked at those last time. What I'm doing is I'm showing you that Peter and Jude, which we're going to study in a moment, this was their worldview here. This is what they learned. This is what was talking. And you got together at dinner, you were talking about all these different writings. The writings were crystal clear that in interpreting Genesis 6, these watchers, which are equivalent to the sons of God, or these angels, came down and produced these giants. Okay? So that's swirling around. It's percolating in Jude's mind and Peter's mind, and I'll prove it to you in a moment. So on the bottom there, we'll just keep going. What I did here is I just gave you a few examples of how New Testament writers made reference to these other books, these non-inspired books. And for example, the first one is Jude, which is inspired. He says there, Jude 1:14, it was also about these men that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all and to convict all of the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in ungodly way, of it all the harsh things which ungodly sinners. What word does he like? So what Jude does is he's writing to his audience, and he says, oh, by the way, the seventh guy from Adam, which is Enoch. How do you know that? Well, Genesis 5 tells us. He made this prophecy. And you go, Jude, you're Jesus' half-brother. Where in the world, how would you know what Enoch prophesied back thousands and thousands of years ago before the flood? Where in the world, how do you know that? Well, I've given you, right below that is 1 Enoch 1:9, which is a book that was flown around during the time, but again, Jesus' day. And you can compare it. It's an exact quote. So here he's reading the book of Enoch, 1 Enoch 1:9, and he says, well, that's a great verse. I'm going to quote that. And so then Jude, in his writing, quotes this book. So clearly Jude is familiar with the book of Enoch. And that's going to be important because prior to this in Jude 6, which we'll get to, he makes reference to this scenario, these angels coming down. So we know that he has the book of Enoch in front of him, or at least in his mind. Okay? Number 2 there, again, Jude, he says this, but Michael the archangel, when he disputed with the devil and argued about the body of Moses, did not dare pronounce against him a railing judgment, but said, the Lord rebuke you. Where in the world is that story from? That Michael is scoring off against the devil, arguing about the book or the body of Moses. Nowhere in the Old Testament are you going to find that. But what you do have is, I mentioned there that there's 2 books, Assumption of Moses and Testament of Moses, that were well known in Jesus' day, but there's no longer any copies of them. There's some quotes that are referenced in the church fathers. Oh yeah, in the Testament of Moses, it talks about, Moses and the devil squaring off. And what you see, it's fascinating that I have one commentary where this guy's examining all these quotes in the church fathers, and they're not referencing Jude. They're actually referencing the book, which is no longer around. It's gone missing. But Jude quotes it in part of his argument. And you're going, okay, well, that's nice. Does it mean here's the comment that we have to make sure. Just because Jude references one verse out of the book of Enoch doesn't mean the whole thing is true. Just because he references the Testament of Moses or the Assumption of Moses doesn't mean that whole book is true, because there's some crazy stuff, especially when you get to the rest of the book of Enoch. In 2 Timothy 3:8, just one other example, Paul's just writing and he says, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth. Men of depraved mind rejected in regard to the faith. He's talking about the 2 of the Egyptian, over here at the Exodus, 2 of the Egyptian magicians. He names them. Well, if you read the book of Exodus, it doesn't name them. They're like, well, Paul, where are you getting this information? And so I've given you the history of that. Again, other books there that make reference to Janus and Jambres. And he says, yeah, he pulls that out and he shares it with us. So as we think about that, Paul and there's many others. I just gave you a couple examples. So let's go to page, is that 4? Yeah, page 4. Now, what we're going to do here, before we get into the New Testament perspective, I just want to read, it's on the top of your sheet. This is 1 Enoch chapter 6. It's really easy to remember because it's Genesis 6 and 1 Enoch 6. Okay. So, exactly where this writing comes from, no idea. Do scholars believe that the original Enoch, the seventh from Adam, wrote this? No. I don't think any scholar would actually affirm that that's the case. All we know is that there's a lot of writings, and a lot of these are called pseudepigrapha, right? Like they're writings that have a false name to them. So somebody's writing, he's like, well, I want my book to become well known, so I'm gonna throw Enoch's name at the top. So how it gets there, we don't know. All we know is that this existed, and it provides some very interesting backstory to the Genesis 6 events. And we know that Jude was reading it, and Peter was reading it, and we'll see for a moment how they make reference to it. So this is this version. It came to pass that when the sons of men multiplied, in those days beautiful and fair daughters were born. That sounds very much like Genesis 6:1. And the angels, the sons of heaven, saw them and desired them, and said to one another, come, let us choose for ourselves wives from people, and we will beget for ourselves children. So it's adding a little bit to the story, right? And Samayaza, who was their ruler, said, I fear that you will not desire to do this deed, and I alone will be a debtor of great sin. Then they all swore together, and they anathematized one another. What does that mean? This is the word that we get in Galatians 1:9. If somebody brings a false gospel, let it be anathema, cursed. So that's what the word. They all swore together, and they got these curses against one another by it. And these were the 200 who descended in the days of Jared to the summit of Mount Hermon, and they called the Mount Hermon because they swore and anathematized one another by it. And then it gives their names of all these, some of their names anyway, the leaders of these 200. That's really fascinating here. So we'll get rid of this for a moment. We'll get rid of Babel. We'll move the flood over here. All right. So this will be the flood. So prior to this, in the days of Jared, you got 200, according to this version, 200 of these watchers. Remember, watchers is just a word for sons of God. It's another phrase for angels. We've been learning all that over the past, so many weeks. Okay. This is super, super important here. There's, in the days of Jared means to come down. That's what the name means. 200 of them. What was the location? Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is the highest peak in Israel proper. It's to the northeast of the Farbolan Heights. It's the one place, if you go around March, you'll see snow. And then it slowly melts off. And they ski there. I've actually been to the top in the summertime. It gives you a great view of all Lebanon and Syria. It's really awesome. The reason why Mount Hermon is important is later, I'll just give you a little sneak peek. Later, when Jesus is about ready to go to Jerusalem to die, it says that he went up to a high mountain and became transfigured. He took Peter, James, and John with him. And then Moses and Elijah show up, and they do a little conversation. But it's interesting that we don't know in the New Testament which mountain it was, but the only high mountain where he was, based on the geography of being up at Dan at Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16. And then Matthew 16, he's at Caesarea Philippi, and then Matthew 17, it says he's at a high mountain. So it's right there. I think contextually, it's very clear. But Jesus specifically goes to Mount Hermon to transfigure himself, which is fascinating. And the idea behind it is that Jesus went to the exact spot where these angels came down to thwart God's plans. Because what we haven't discussed is, why did they do it? And we know from over here, Genesis 3, that what was the promise that God gave Eve?
Your offspring will be
Yes.
strength worth of.
Hey, what are your descendants? Well, it was a promise that he gave. He was talking to Satan, but he was about Eve. He said, "Hey, look, Satan, you're going to be your defeat's coming. Your defeat is going to come at the hands of one of the woman's offspring, one of the woman's descendants." And so, as they progressed through, scholars we don't know, but they came down in order to contaminate all humanity, in order to prevent that threat. So if they could contaminate humanity, then there would be no way for a true human to be born, which would be their defeat.
There was no genetic connection between Jesus and Mary.
I'm not following. Mary, which Mary?
Mary, the mother of Jesus. Right?
Yeah, he got his 23 chromosomes from her. So that's what created his humanity.
Yeah.
So he's 100% human from that regard. His fatherly line is spiritual. So he doesn't have the Y chromosome, so to speak, or the other 23 that we'd imagine, or maybe God gave him all throughout. How he did it, we don't know. But he definitely was 100% part of her ovary, her DNA.
But without sin.
But without sin. Yeah. So that's what provides some interesting dynamics in the sense of the virgin birth. But yeah, that's what allowed him. He's 100% Mary's genetics, for sure, which creates humanity. But if they could corrupt it, then there'd be nobody left to provide a real 100% pure bloodline. That's why in Genesis 6:9, there's some arguments back and forth about what Genesis 6:9 means, because it says God saw Noah, and Noah found grace in the eyes of God, and it says that because he was perfect in his genealogy or in his generation. So they'll argue it both ways. One was, in his contemporaries, here was a good guy. Another way, to be a little bit more literal, is his genealogy or his genetics were not corrupt, and that's why God chose it. Which seems contextual to me, but it's hard to argue it grammatically in that regard. Okay?
Do you want to mention Wyatt at this time?
Are you?
23 chromosomes and Wyatt's
Supposed
5.
Let's do it.
Well, there's he was an amateur archaeologist, and he went in search of all sorts of different biblical artifacts in Jerusalem. One of his claims before he died of cancer was that he found the Ark of the Covenant, and it was under Golgotha, and it was basically, the idea was when the earthquake occurred, the earth broke open as Christ is dying, the blood dropped through this crack and landed on top of the mercy seat, which should have been buried and hidden under Golgotha. So what he claimed was he found it. He actually spoke to an angel who told him not to tell anybody, but the blood fell down under the mercy.
Cousin was Joseph Smith, but go on.
It fell down to the mercy seat, and he scraped some of the blood off. He took it in and had it examined, and it had 23 chromosomes, not 46. And I thought that's where Moses got, that's where Moses, where Mondo got the 23 rather quick, because that's kind of intellectually pretty brilliant to say you found some blood of Jesus and say it only has 23 chromosomes, which is really a good connecting the dots on Wyatt's behalf. But for what it's worth, the priest would sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. That was the final part of the atonement process in the Old Testament. We don't know if it's true, so it's doubtful.
I'll tell you what, it's got a character. Ron Wyatt was an amateur archaeologist, and he had a website. It's called Wyatt Archaeological Research, WAR. And he was very well known in the 90s. But this guy, man, talk about he was the chosen archaeologist of existence, because not only did he find the Ark of the Covenant, he found Noah's Ark, for sure. What was the other thing that he found?
The wheels on
he found wheels. So then he found Noah's Ark, he found the Ark of the Covenant. There was another thing that he found. It was wheels under there. It wasn't the Holy Grail. That would have been really cool. Okay.
But found Moses' tomb. No, Noah's tomb. Noah's gravestone.
So one guy has found it all. Everything everybody's been searching for, and he has been chosen to find all of it. And you were like, wow, man, but he is completely disregarded and mocked and everything else under the sun.
Good.
Oh, the real Mount Sinai, he found that too.
Oh, that's right.
So I don't look pretty though.
I think he did.
Maybe, maybe not.
I mean, some of this stuff is plausible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
I'll get him on Sinai.
So, nevertheless, moving on. Okay, so now let's come here on the middle of that sheet there, with the top paragraph, those 8 verses in our mind. Let's look at 2 Peter as an example. So, the book of 2 Peter, as well as the book of Jude, are against. The theme of them is preaching against false teachers. Hey, everybody, false teachers are coming to the church. They're going to creep in unnoticed. They're going to deceive many. You need to watch out for them. They're this, and God is going to judge them. Don't worry about it. Your job is to be discerning and be aware of it. And so that's the theme of both 2 Peter and the book of Jude. So he says here, I just jumped right in at chapter 3, or chapter 2, verse 3. In their greed, so hold on, just remember some of these bolded words, okay? And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. He's talking about the false teachers. 4. So he's like, okay, I'm telling you guys, don't get caught up with the false teachers. If you do, you might be a part of their judgment. And this is, well, how do we know that they're going to be judged? He said, let me give you an example. 4, God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment. God did not spare the ancient world, but reserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives after, and if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, he's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and he goes on. Verse 9, that the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from temptation and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment. Okay, so there's a lot there, but what's the progression? If we were to get rid of this for a moment, and let's see, let's put Genesis 6 here. The flood is 6 through 9. And then let's fast forward over to Genesis 18 and 19, which is Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, I'll just put Sodom and Gomorrah. And then we also have the person of Lot. Okay. What you see here is very clearly the progression. That he starts with the angels, then he goes to Noah, which, of course, Noah's 6 through 9. He appears there. And then he goes to Sodom and Gomorrah, and then he goes and he starts talking about Lot. Here we have a very consistent sequence, right? It's in order. So the question is, you look and you go, imagine if you didn't have anything else. You just picked up 2 Peter, and you're going, he's telling you, hey, don't worry about those false teachers. They're going to get their judgment. Because let me show you how God is consistent. God's going to judge the false teachers, and we know this because God's nature is the same. And if he didn't spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into hell in the pits of darkness, reserved for judgment. And you go, what angels? What's he talking about here? He doesn't tell us. What angels that sinned? Oh, maybe he's talking about Satan back here. Satan, and as we saw last time, the whole idea of Satan bringing 1/3 of the angels down, we saw that wasn't the case prior over here. What's left out here is which angels is he talking about that sinned in some amazing way that he cast them. I have there cast them into hell. This is a word Tartarus. It's the only place it appears in all the New Testament, and it's a very well-known Greek word. And if you were to go over here, let's just say this is the surface of the earth, and you had Hades down here. There's one place lower, and that's Tartarus. And this is that's the serious place you don't want to go. So we're left wondering, what angels is he talking about? But what's the hint?
Genesis 6.
The hint is that he says over here, they occurred prior to Noah,
Right.
and then the flood, and then Sodom and Gomorrah. So then, based on the context of the sequence, we go, wow, it was over here somewhere. That's all we know. That's all we can get contextually from this. Okay? I don't necessarily go through all those. You can read those later. But verse 3, there is a sequence there. Let's see. So, what does Peter say about these angels specifically? Because that's really what we're at. That they sinned, the bolted is pits of darkness reserved for judgment, and he cast them into hell. We have those three things. Peter, I'm reading Genesis 6, and I don't see any of that. Where in the world are you getting this information from? Oh, well, I was just inspired. God downloaded it to me, and I'm giving you something that has never existed. And that's not the way inspiration works. What we're going to see in a moment, we're going to see where Peter gets this information from. Okay, so let's go over to the next page. Now we're in the book of Jude. Same thing, talking about false teachers. And I've bolded some things that he brings up. For certain persons have crept in unnoticed, those who were long before embarked out for condemnation, ungodly persons who turn the grace of our God into licentiousness and deny our only Master, Lord Jesus Christ. So again, he's describing the false teachers as being greedy, being sensual, licentious. They turned the grace of God, which is wonderful to be forgiven, and they went over here and ran with it, and they say, hey, if we're living under grace, let's go sin. This is awesome. And he says, stay away from those people because their condemnation, they've been marked out for condemnation. Don't get roped in with them. He said, now I desire to remind you, verse 5, though you know all these things once and for all, that the Lord, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, subsequently destroyed those who did not believe. So what he does here, Jude doesn't go sequential, but he gives us more information that we're not left guessing. So for whatever reason, he jumps over here to really the book of Exodus, okay, 1 through 15, all right? So he says, oh, by the way, that group, they came out, God rescued mighty deliverance, and then they didn't believe, and man, God wiped them out in the 40-year wilderness wandering. So he starts there. But then in verse 6, and angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day, just as. So now he's connecting this group here with this group over here, angels. And he does it by saying, just as. All right? This is going to be really important. He says, oh, but yeah, I got to judge that group, but I want to tell you even more. There's this other group, these angels, who left two things. Their proper domain, or their own domain, and their proper abode. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they, the angels, in the same way as these, the Sodomites, indulged in gross immorality, sexual immorality, and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire. So this is fascinating because in our modern culture, these two things are connected. It's connected for two good reasons. The angels that sinned by going after strange or contrary flesh that they were not allowed to go after, right? And the two words, I think I put it under here. Yes, the next paragraph. You can just read that on your own. The highlight is the two words there, their domain and their abode. Basically, these angels left their own dimension, spiritual world. They crossed over into the physical world and participated in things they shouldn't have. And they're in big trouble for that. One of the ways that they did it is they left their jurisdiction and their spiritual boundary. And he says one of the sins that they're responsible for was this sexual immorality. And we know, why is it immoral? Well, it's immoral for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is because they crossed their boundaries. God has set up certain boundaries. That's very important in understanding what you see today. Scholars, it's amazing how they if you go to Genesis 18 and they talk about the sin of homosexuality as an example, they'll say, oh, Sodom and Gomorrah was not about sexual immorality at all. And that is not even on the radar. So anybody that wants to say that homosexuality is a sin based on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and God judging it is wrong. And they will quote Ezekiel 16, which there, Ezekiel's highlighting some of the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. And of the list of sins that he gives there, one of them is abominations. It doesn't tell us what those are. The other ones were pride, arrogance, they had a lack of hospitality, etc., etc., etc. So what modern scholars do that are trying to find justification for homosexual relationships, they'll say, see, Ezekiel 16 mentioned nothing about homosexual relationships at all. The reason that God wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah as well as all the other cities around was because they lacked hospitality. And you go, oh, well, that's pretty serious sin. Maybe they have pride. But Ezekiel is referencing a Old Testament perspective. What are some other abominations in the Old Testament? You have Leviticus 18, you have Leviticus 22. Both of those are 18 and 20, actually. What you have here is if a male lies with a male, it's an abomination. So just because Ezekiel doesn't list out specifically, he doesn't need to, because we understand abomination from Leviticus, okay? But if we go to the book of Jude, Jude tells us that these guys, tell me if I'm reading it as unclear. They, in the same way, indulged in gross immorality, going after strange flesh or contrary flesh. So, if you take a man, what are the boundaries for him? To enjoy women. Women is what they're allowed under a marriage context, right? If he goes out and takes another man, he has crossed a boundary that God has forbidden in the same way that these angels did. Their boundary is different, but it's still a boundary that was crossed that God had ordained. So you see the connection here? One, their sin helps contribute to the understanding of the angels, and their sin helps contribute to the understanding of what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. It's clearly a sexual thing here. All right. Let's see. So I think what else I want to see here. So what Jude is saying is, hey guys, these false teachers, don't get roped into them. Their judgment is sure, just as sure as the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, that God wiped out the cities because of their sexual immorality. And in the same way, you can be sure that those false teachers are going to be judged because God didn't spare the angels either. They went outside their boundary, and notice what he describes here in verse 6. They're kept in eternal chains or bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. We can ask the same question. Jude, where are you getting this information? When I read Genesis 6, I didn't see any of that. It makes no reference of God's judgment at all. Well, let's turn the page.
Making break time.
What I did here was went through the book of Enoch, where this story appears, and you can see how the book of Enoch describes this episode of Genesis 6, as well as the judgment. There in chapter 10, this is God speaking, said to Raphael, who's a good angel, bind Azael foot and hand. There's the word bind. Cast him into darkness. Open the desert that is in the Daduel and cast him in, and lay down upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness. Let him dwell there for eternity to cover his face so he cannot see light. And on the great day of judgment, he will be led into the fire. And you go, wow, that's pretty serious. when both Jude and 2 Peter are writing about these angels that sinned, that's what he's describing here, and they've been put down in eternal chains, they're down in the pits of darkness. This is where they're getting it from. It's not in Genesis, it's in Enoch. And the parallels are crystal clear. And then he goes on, and to Michael, we know Michael, archangel, go and reveal to Semyaza and to those remaining with him who have mixed with women to defile themselves in their uncleanness. This is a sexual term. And when their sons, this is the Nephilim, the offspring, when their sons will slay one another and they see the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them for 70 generations in the valley of the earth until the day of their judgment and consummation, until the judgment of the age of eternity is completed. Then they will be led away into the chasm of fire and to the torture and to the prison of eternal confinement. So Enoch is pretty harsh as it relates to these angels that sinned and what their future holds. And both Jude and Peter are picking up on that language. And then, just to be thorough here, chapter 14, a record of words of righteousness and rebukes of the watchers who are from eternity, according to the commandment of the Holy and Great One in his mission. I saw during my sleep what I now speak in a human tongue, in the spirit of my mouth, which the Great One gave to humans, to speak among themselves in an understanding of the heart. He who created and gave in order to convict the watchers, the sons of heaven. Go on in verse 6. And in order that concerning these things you should see the destruction of your beloved sons, and that there would be no advantage of them to you, but they would fall by the sword. It's interesting that you have Jude and Peter being intimately familiar with this material. And they're using it from an inspired perspective to give us an understanding of what's happening in Genesis 6. And as I said, if you look on the some of you have this on the back page, that there's different perspectives on what Genesis 6 is mean. I think the angel view is 100% consistent with the rest of the New Testament, including the New Testament, including Jude and Peter, as well as during the time of Jesus, all the writings. But some people say, no, they're not angels. And you go, well, okay. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. What I think is interesting as well is that there's another little nugget here, in that when we look, it's a really mess. When we look at this period, okay, let me just clean this up for a moment. Because context is important, right? Of all things. And so let's put Genesis 6 back here. And we'll put the flood on this side. So prior to this, okay, we're going to use some real logic here. This is pre-flood, okay? What's going on here? Well, contextually, Peter and Jude are talking about false teachers. And you would think, why in the world are they bringing angels up as an example of sure judgment? Because the context is teaching. But yet it's fascinating here. What were these watchers, what were they doing when they came down? Well, we know that they were getting human women. But one of the other things that we learn in producing Nephilim, these offspring, these hybrids. First, Enoch says, and they took wives for themselves, each of them chose for themselves wives, and they began to enter them and to be defiled in them. And they taught them sorceries and enchantments and root cutting, and explained the plants to them. So the watchers had all of this knowledge. We don't know how long they were around. They observed. We know that, again, according to Job 38, 6 and 7, that the watchers or the sons of God observed the creation of the earth. So they're watching all this. They have access from the beginning of astronomy, how God created, the physics of the world, the biological laws. They came down, according to the book of Enoch anyway, teaching these forbidden arts. Chapter 8, verse 1 says, Azael taught the people how to make swords and armor and shields and breastplates, lessons of angels, and he showed them metals and their working and armbands and decorations. And for you women, also eye painting of beautiful eyes. The angels came down teaching the women cosmetics, how to make themselves look better. Does it work? Yes. It does work.
Essentially how to be sexual.
Right. And they came down teaching them this, at least according to the book of Enoch, and all kinds of chosen stones and fits for dyeing. Verse 3, Semiraza taught enchantments and root cutting, other enchantments, astronomy, astrology, stargazing, and courses of the moon. 9:6, you saw all that Azael has done, who has taught all the unrighteousness upon the earth and revealed the mysteries of the ages, the things in heaven. Finally, the last one there. Enoch said to Azael, well, let me give you the background here, according to the book of Enoch. So these 200 angels come down and they start teaching all these things. And imagine them going to a man, a father, and saying, hey, if you give me your daughter, I'll teach you some secrets. Sure, tell me. Tell me how to make war. Tell me how to do metal. Tell me. I mean, there's wealth in all of that. There's wealth in knowledge, right? Knowledge is power, right, Angel? This is all tights, okay? When they sinned, God was furious. So then these guys, they go to Enoch, according to the book of Enoch. Enoch, we're in trouble. Will you please go and petition to the Creator to forgive us? Enoch says, sure, I'll talk to him. So Enoch goes to God and says, God, will you please forgive them and let them off the hook? And he says, no way. You go back and tell them that they have disobeyed my command. They were heavenly, not earthly. They were supposed to remain. I have made them immortal. They can't die, so their species will never cease to exist. But humanity, if everybody stopped producing children right now, with 100 years, humanity would cease to exist, probably, right? Maybe let's go 150. Humanity, the earth is empty. We're all dead. God says, for them, I've created sexual reproduction as a way to perpetuate the species. You angels, you didn't need that. That's why I never gave you women. I never gave you sex. I never gave you reproduction, because you live forever. Angels will always exist unless God sees fit to kill them in some way. But humans are not like that because they sinned. So because they've sinned in this way, they've crossed those boundaries, you go back and tell them not only no, fill in the blank, we know they're going to eternal judgment into Tartarus. And so that's what you have in the context here. Enoch said to Azael, hey, you've requested, I went and talked to God, this is your answer. Go, you will not have peace. Great judgment came against you to bind you, and there will be no forbearance and request for leniency for you, because you revealed unrighteous things because of all the impious deeds and the unrighteousness and the sin, or that you taught to humans. It's interesting that if we get into the background of both 2 Peter and Jude, clearly he's referring to the book of Enoch as it relates to what's, again, I use the word percolating in their mind. As Jude, he says, hey, in Jude verse 1 through 3, he goes, hey, guys, I was going to write to you about our common salvation. I was just going to write you a nice, encouraging exhortation, but I'm compelled now to write you something different. And as he begins to write about the false teachers and the risk of them coming into the church and corrupting things, he starts whipping out all of this Enochian thinking. And he presents it to us as at least proving the theology of them coming down and teaching, and therefore, hey guys, those false teachers are going to get it. How do you know that? Because these false teachers got it, and God is consistent.
But going back to Enoch 8:1, talking about working with metals, if you go to Genesis 4:27, you see that Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain's sister is... Anyway, so you bet those earliest Genesis 4, Tubal-Cain, he's the grandson of Cain, right? See the grandson?
I'm not sure it's that, Bill. See, the genealogy's there.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, so he's working with metal in Genesis 4.
So we have these metals So how that connects with the times of Jared, we don't know from a chronological perspective. But what we do know is that where did he get this idea of metals from? Well, according to Enoch, which might or might not be true, we don't know. All we know, this is why we're bringing this up. Not that I'm saying that this is 100% accurate, but this is the storyline that both Jude and Peter are living in. And when they come to teach us about Genesis 6, and the corruption that took place, this was a major rebellion against God in trying to corrupt and contaminate mankind. And then God wiped them out in the flood. And so based on Genesis 6:4, what we do know is going back over here to 1446 BC, the time of the Exodus, or really specifically the initial time of the conquest. When they come to spy out the land, what's the land full of? Nephilzer, giants, the Anakim, all these different tribes. And what's fascinating is if you look, this is Genesis 6. If we go here to Genesis 12, and then we go here to 14, one of the synonymous terms in the Old Testament for, you have Nephilim, you have Anakim, you have Rephaim. They're all very similar. Okay? God chose, so flood happens, Noah battles here, whatever. Then he says, Abraham, leave your land. I want you to go to a land I'm going to show you. Abraham, I want you to walk in the land. I'm going to give this land to you and your descendants, and we're going to see the sermon today. In you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Abraham's like, this is awesome. Cool. I'm going to walk to and fro in the land of Israel. This is my land. And he says, hey, by the way, in Genesis later, he says, it's not going to happen for 400 years. So they're going to go down to Egypt. They'll be back. Trust me. Okay. Believe me, Genesis 15. Interestingly, Moses tells us in chapter 14 that the land was filled with Rephaim on the eastern side of the Jordan. And if we're to, I won't draw, maybe I will. Okay. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here is Israel, all right? Oh, that works perfect. Here's the Jordan River, right? Over here, Mount Hermon. Over here is called the land of Bashan, right at underneath Mount Hermon. What Moses tells us is that over here in the land of Bashan is where all the Rephaim live. We also later, Og is there, who's 12, 13 feet tall. He lives on this side in a couple cities, right at the base of where it all started, according to the book of Enoch. It's pretty fascinating. So that as early as Genesis 14, in the time of Abraham, the Rephaim were here. And it's like when we start to try to figure out motive, we see why Satan filled the earth, tried to contaminate humanity. But then God reveals his next plan is, hey, I'm going to take Abraham and his kids, and I'm going to make of them a great nation, and then through him all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. That's a pretty amazing promise. Satan's like, well, all this is going to happen in the land of Israel. I got to prevent that. So somehow some of them come down again, and they fill the land with Rephaim, so that when the conquest, when they come to spy it out, the land is full of them. They're intimidating. The spies are scared. Man, they were like grasshoppers in their sight. We can't do it. And then we know the story. And what you see in the theology of the book of Genesis is an example. You think, again, writers, they pick certain things to help prove their point. They're not exhaustive. They didn't give us everything we wanted to know. But as we see the progression of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, especially in Deuteronomy, when down here, working on whatever your point is, Mount Sinai, there you go, Bob's over there. For everyone else outside, that's over here.
Now it's a sign of here, brother.
So there's actually 12 different potential sites. But it has one. Yeah, pick one, and that's the one. Okay. I've actually been to the one down here in St. Catherine's, but I didn't see God there. I didn't see a burning bush either, so it must not be it. But as they were approaching up, God did not take them up this way. He took them around over here, and they crossed in there. And as they're going in Deuteronomy 2, it says, oh, they found this Nephilim tribe, wiped them out. Oh, they went over here. They didn't need to wipe out the Nephilim tribe there because God had wiped them out long ago. Well, that's interesting that he's using that as an example. And they come up and they see Og and Heshbon, and they start Sihon, remember him? They took care of him. They took care of Og. And then they go in. And the final verse that is very helpful, which we'll get to, but as a preface, they come in and they conquer under Joshua. Well, let's read it. We'll finalize it on this. This is where Joshua
Esau does battle.
yeah, down here.
Yeah.
Because it says there were some down here that, the descendants of Edom or Esau had already wiped out. But the goal, the progression is to be wiping out these Nephilim tribes. So Joshua 11, like verse 22, check 21 to see context, but this is the summary, that theology of the first 5 books gets carried into the book of Joshua. You got it?
Yep, without. So 21 is, and at the time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Aneph, from all the mountains of Judah and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. 23.
Okay, that's enough? Yeah. What we know from this word, this super important here, this word Anakim, you go, well, who are those guys? Well, according to Numbers 13:32, I put it on there, they were the descendants of the Nephilim. So we're not reaching here. Okay? But the Anakim, it says when he came in, we did a good job. We wiped them all out. But a few of them went west. They went over here to these Philistine cities. One of them you should recognize. Gath. Who's from Gad? Goliath. Tall guy, right? One of the descendants of the giants. So what we see, it's not till the time of David, which is 400 and some years later, that the rest of them are wiped out. But it's fascinating. So if you look at all of Old Testament history, what began here, God wiped out. They come back in the land in 14. God says, well, I'll take care of them in about 400 years. Then at the time of the conquest, he uses his new nation, Israel, to wipe out these Nephilim, which were trying to interrupt God's plan of redemption. Well, then, later in the time of David, David and his mighty men take out the rest of them, and they never appear again anywhere.
Except in the mountains, the North America.
Potentially in the mountains of North America. I'm almost getting ready to dig on one, so that'll be fun. Oh, did you feel potentially? We got one in the works.
There's some
Right. So what we see is this is the Mediterranean, right? This is the Med Sea. Okay. Yeah, we'll find the solution. We got the Med, the Red, and the Dead. That's how you remember when you're in Israel. Okay. What it shows is historically, there is some archaeological evidence that not only did they come here, but some of them fled over here, all the way over to Northwest Africa, and then potentially they were part of the Phoenician group, potentially sailed across. And there's lots of evidence that 8, 9, 10 footers in mounds all through America. And it's interesting, I'll give you a little tidbit that if you were to go to the Smithsonian today and you'd say, hey, you know what, I was reading this book and it talked about all these articles that were in newspapers back in the late 1800s about how all these giants were found, that there's thousands and thousands of mounds across really Central and Eastern America. There's giants found in these mounds. No, and the Smithsonian would say, no, there was no giants. These are just Native Americans. These are Native American mounds, no giants, nothing to see here, blah, blah, blah. So what I decided to do was you can go online and you can research and find, I'll say it this way, you can find all of the Smithsonian field excavation reports. All complete, at least currently online. So what I did is I went on there and I stole them all so that they don't disappear one day. And I went through probably 50 years worth from 1849 on looking for words like giant, 9-footer, 8-footer, gigantic axe. There was, and so my goal was to provide evidence that in their own writings, they're a bunch of liars. And one of the articles that were done, these are all by secular archaeologists. One of them, this is clearly in there. The skull that we found had a circumference of 36 inches.
Jeez. 3 feet.
You can think about the skull being that wide, where you could, and they talked about how huge it was, and they said, although we found an axe that could only have been wielded by a giant. So, it's interesting that what we see is somehow they sailed over to America, and according to, which is hard, according to a lot of Native American traditions, they had these battles with these giants. And, oh yeah, they were part of us. And if you ask the Native Americans, this is really fascinating too. Hey, who built the mounds? These mounds are ginormous, right? Tremendous mathematical, astronomical precision. There's no way that these ancient Native Americans that didn't have any writing, didn't understand Pythagorean theorem. All these things are set up in such a way to be astronomically perfect. It's amazing to see that side of it. And the Native Americans are going, we didn't build these. And the white archaeologist at the Smithsonian will tell you, no, the Native Americans built it. The Native Americans going, you're a white man. You don't know about our history. We didn't build them. How many times do we have to tell you this? They were here when we came here. No, your people built them. Okay, well, fine. Tell us what you... But what you see is in the history and the evidence, clearly not the case. So when we see the astronomy and the precision of these mounds, geometrically even, it's not surprising based on the potential knowledge that, according to the book of Enoch, was taught to them. So, but that leaves us from a biblical perspective. Next week, so here's Genesis 6 rebellion. Next time we're going to see the Tower of Babel rebellion. Here's the question, let's summarize it here. Why is the world in a mess? Because of Adam and Eve messing up, and these angels that came down and they caused havoc in our understanding of knowledge and metallurgy and these other things. War. That was one of the reasons that caused a whole bunch of trouble. And according to, as I've given you on here, especially if you look on page 3 there, the writings at the time of Jesus were filled with this perspective. If you want to know why things are bad, that's why. And then the next time we'll see the Tower of Babel and how that came to be. Yes?
For these writings,
In my reading, in regards to this, picking up other things outside of here, starting to assume that these writings were presented with the works as creation to a certain extent. I mean, they have their own history. All right, they are books of history. They're books of,
it's not inspired version, right? But they were caught.
They were what?
They were caught.
Oh, for sure.
They were caught in the synagogues as this is your history.
Do you see copies of these in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Yeah.
They were very well known. Again, not full copies, but pieces. They go, oh, that's the Book of Enoch. Oh, that's another. That was the Hebrew version. Oh, that's the Book of Jubilees. We see all that. And we've incorporated it because they're copy. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, you're like, this was what they found it. Any last comments?
I have a family member is I just read this, and this describes her bent with New Age, and you see where it comes from.
Yeah.
And it's just it's almost like these angels, they wanted to give humanity like an in on things that God was hiding from them on purpose.
so that they can say kind of like the same deception with Eve with the tree.
Yep.
And I'll
Keeping something from you, right?
Yeah, God's keeping something. And so, like, I see this with my family member. It's like the church has blinded you, you know, and all these things. Well, God would not have created if he didn't want us to know it. And yet there's certain things that God, for our own good, has set boundaries for. And she even changed her name to a very, like when it talks about the sky gazing, I won't say it just in case somebody ever listens to this.
Fair enough.
But yeah, she changed her name to a very astrological thing. And it's just, you see where the attitude and the bent has come. And I'm just like, hell, this is the new age. This is everything.
It's very clear. Well, Gnosticism too. It's the exact same thing.
Yes.
It's all based on knowledge.
So, in wrapping this up again, the Nephilim, when they die, their bodies are drowned. According to 1 Enoch chapter 15, their spirits are not allowed to go to heaven or to hell, but they become demons. And that's why when you get to, which we'll get to in the New Testament, when Jesus shows up, it's like a demon on every corner. I mean, you're like, what in the world? All the demons were unleashed. And that's why in Matthew 8, Luke 8, these other passages, that these demons come and they say, we know who you are, Jesus. Have you come to torment us before the time? We know where we're going. Don't send us into the abyss, into these eternal chains. Jesus says, okay, go to the pigs. But in 1 Timothy 4:1, the demons, the children of these teachers are like their dads, like father, like son. 1 Timothy 4:1 talks about doctrines of demons, astrology, New Age. They have kept their influence and contamination of humanity all the way until the present day. So it's not like it's done and over. We still see all these false things being doctrines of demonic forces. And how many are there? Millions. Who knows? So we're not out of the woods. There's still. The question is, why is the earth so bad today? Because those guys came down, and now we are still getting the effects of their spiritual unclean children known as demons. That's first Enoch 15. So, all right. Well, let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you that none of this is a surprise to you for sure. And we know from what you tell us is that you absolutely have victory over all these efforts to thwart your plan. And we know that Jesus defeated them on the cross, that you have publicly disarmed them for believers for sure. And so I just pray that you continue to give us wisdom as we see the majesty, you know, as Paul says, the manifold wisdom that you had, and when they killed Jesus, it sealed their own defeat, and you outsmarted it. And so the gospel is meant to help us to overcome not only our sin problem, but Jesus' work on the cross defeats all of his enemies for sure as well. And so help us to continue to see your grand narrative of the Bible and all that you're doing. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.